maintain the cabin, and watch 3 children in country, where moments inattention could mean a rattlesnake bite or a fall into the creek. She needed a solution that didn't require her to be into places at once. The idea came to her in early June while she was splitting rounds near the cabin. Rain had started suddenly, and she'd rushed to cover the woodpile with canvas. But water had already soaked into the split pieces on top. Wetwood meant smoke instead of heat, and smoke meant wasted fuel and a cold cabin. She'd spent the next 2 days moving the entire pile under the eave on the cabin's south side, where the extended roof provided some protection, but the eave only covered about 4 feet of ground, and she needed space for 8 cords. That's when she looked at the cabin itself and realized the structure was the solution. What if she built the woodshed around the cabin instead of separate from it? She could extend the roof line outward by 6 feet on all 4 sides, creating a covered corridor that would keep firewood dry and accessible without requiring a separate trip outside. The extended roof would shelter the wood from rain and snow, while allowing air circulation to season it properly. More importantly, it would put the fuel supply within immediate reach of the door, eliminating the need to fight through storms to reach a distant wood pile. The design would look unusual, a small cabin surrounded by a much larger roof structure. But function mattered more than appearance when survival was at stake. She sketched the plan on a piece of bark using charcoal, calculating materials and costs. She'd need additional posts to support the extended roof, more split shakes for coverage, and considerable labor to construct it. The lumber would cost money she didn't have, but the surrounding forest provided standing dead pine that she could fell and mill herself. Using her father's techniques, the project would take most of the summer, time she'd otherwise spend cutting firewood in the traditional way. If she was wrong about the design's efficiency, she'd enter winter with inadequate fuel and no time to correct the mistake. If she was right, she'd have dry firewood within arm's reach regardless of weather. And the extended roof would provide additional benefits she was only beginning to calculate. Reverend Elias Marsh heard about the plan when Eliza mentioned it. After Sunday services in Unionville, he was 47, had established 3 churches across Montana Territory, and believed strongly in proper order and traditional methods. Sister Thornton, he said with the patient tone of someone correcting a child, I've seen many homesteaders attempt novel solutions to common problems, and I've buried several who ignored proven wisdom. A woodshed belongs separate from a dwelling. For good reason. Fire is your greatest danger out here. If your woodpile catches a spark, do you want it surrounding your home with your children inside? Build a proper shed 20 feet from the cabin like everyone else and trust in the Lord to give you strength for the walk. But Eliza had already considered the fire risk and found it less threatening than the alternative. A separate shed meant exposure during storms, and exposure killed more settlers than cabin fires. She'd seen the statistics in the territorial newspaper last winter had claimed 17 lives in the Helena area alone, most from freezing while attempting to reach out buildings during blizzards. A woman had frozen to death 15 feet from her own door, disoriented in whiteout conditions. Eliza's design kept the firewood under a roof extension, not inside the cabin itself, and the open-air corridor would prevent spark accumulation. The risk calculation favored her approach, but explaining that to people who value tradition over innovation was proving difficult. If you're finding value in these stories of frontier wisdom and practical solutions that saved lives, hit that like button. These accounts of settler ingenuity deserve to be remembered and shared. Widow Martha Jenkins ran the Trading Post in Unionville and had opinions on most subjects, particularly those involving women operating outside conventional boundaries. She was 52, had buried 2 husbands, and had survived by being shrewd rather than sentimental. When Eliza came in to purchase nails and hinges in late June, Martha didn't hide her skepticism. I heard about your building project, she said, weighing out 16-penny nails on a scale. Folks are talking. They're saying you're wasting time on foolishness when you should be cutting wood like everyone else. You know what happens to people who try to reinvent the wheel out here? They end up buying supplies from me on credit they can't repay, and then I own their claim. I've got for properties already from people who thought they were smarter than experience. The comment stung because it contained truth. Eliza had left her with debt, and the $47 she'd arrived with had dwindled to $18. She was gambling her family's survival on an untested design, and failure meant exactly what Martha described: debt, foreclosure, and a return to Ohio with nothing but shame. But success meant something Martha's conventional wisdom couldn't provide: a sustainable system that a single woman could manage alone. Eliza paid for the nails with coins she'd earned washing laundry for minors and left without. Defending her plan, defending it required proof, and proof required completion. She began construction in early July when the ground was dry and daylight lasted until nearly 10 o'clock. The first step involved setting posts around the cabin's perimeter, each one sunk 3 feet deep and tamped with rocks for stability. She positioned them 6 feet from the cabin walls, creating a corridor wide enough to stack wood 4 feet deep while leaving room to walk. The post stood 8 feet tall, matching the cabin's wall height, and she notched the tops to receive horizontal beams that would support the extended roof structure. The work was slow because she could only manage it during Benjamin's nap time, and after the older children finished their chores. Tommy and Sarah helped dig post holes using a narrow spade and a pry bar, and Eliza did the heavy lifting herself, wrestling posts into position and checking plumb with a string and weight. By mid-July, she had 16 posts set in a rectangle around the cabin, and neighbors who passed by began to take notice. Silas Garrett stopped one afternoon with a hunch of venison and a concerned expression. He was 39, had lost his wife to cholera 2 years earlier, and carried himself with the careful reserve of someone who learned not to offer opinions unless asked. "That's an ambitious project," he said, studying the posts. "You planning to finish before snow?" "I'll finish by September," Eliza said, accepting the venison with gratitude. "I appreciate your concern, but I've calculated the timeline." "It's not the timeline I'm worried about," Silas said. "It's the wood you're not cutting while you build." "Higgins says you need 8 cords minimum. How much do you have stacked?" "Half a cord," Eliza admitted, "but once the roof is up, I'll season wood faster than a traditional pile. The airflow underneath will dry it in half the time, and I won't lose any to ground moisture or snow burial. I'll end up ahead." Silas looked doubtful, but didn't argue. He brought the venison because he suspected she wasn't eating enough, and the thinness of her wrists confirmed it. She was working herself to exhaustion on a design that might or might not function as intended, and if it failed, those 3 children would suffer. But she was also stubborn in the way of people who'd already lost everything and had nothing left to lose but pride. He nodded and left, and Eliza added the venison to a stew that would feed her family. For 3 days, the roof structure took all of August. She cut rafters from standing dead lodgepole pine, each one measuring 12 feet long and 4 in diameter. The rafters extended from the cabin's existing roof line outward to the posts, creating a sloped surface that would shed rain and snow. She notched each rafter to fit snugly against the cabin logs and the outer beams, then secured them with the nails she'd purchased from Martha. The spacing was critical. Too far apart and the shakes would sag. Too close and she'd waste materials. She settled on 16 in intervals, which required 73 individual rafters for the entire perimeter. Cutting, fitting, and securing each one took approximately 2 hours, which meant she was working from dawn until well after dark most days. Sarah proved surprisingly capable with a draw knife, stripping bark from rafters while Tommy hauled them into position. Benjamin's contribution was mostly staying out of the way and occasionally handing up nails, but even that helped. Eliza worked with the methodical focus of someone who understood that every day of construction was a day not spent cutting firewood, and the deficit was growing. By the end of August, she had maybe 3/4 of a cord stacked, which meant she was 7 cords short of Higgins's minimum estimate. With winter approaching fast, Doc Harland rode out from Helena in early September to check on families in the valley. Before roads became impassable, he was 56, had practiced medicine across 3 territories, and had seen enough frontier foolishness to recognize it quickly. when he saw Eliza's structure, now roofed but not yet loaded with firewood. He pulled his horse up short and stared. "What in God's name is that?" he asked. "It's a woodshed," Eliza said, wiping sweat from her forehead. She'd been splitting rounds all morning and had blisters on both palms. "It looks like a cabin wearing a hat," Doc said. "A very large hat. Who designed this?" "I did." Doc dismounted and walked around the structure, examining the posts and rafters, with the critical eye of someone evaluating symptoms. "You've got maybe a cord of wood stacked under there," he said. "You need 8 minimum. Probably 10 to be safe. It's September 5th. You've got maybe 6 weeks before serious cold, 8 weeks before snow that'll shut you in. You can't possibly cut enough wood in that time, which means come January, you'll be burning furniture, and come February, I'll be treating your children for frostbite or worse. I've seen this before, Mrs. Thornton. Pride kills people out here. Just as sure as cold does." Eliza sat down her splitting maul and met his eyes. "I'm not operating on pride, doctor. I'm operating on mathematics. A traditional wood pile loses approximately 30% of its heat value to moisture from ground contact. And snow burial, my design eliminates ground contact entirely and keeps snow off the wood. That means I need 30% less volume to achieve the same heat output. 8 cords at 70% efficiency equals 5.6 cords at full efficiency. I've got 1 cord stacked and 6 weeks to cut for 0.6 more. That's 77 cords per week, which is achievable." Doc stared at her for a long moment. "You've calculated heat efficiency." "My father ran a sawmill. I grew up understanding BTU values and moisture content. Pine at 20% moisture content produces approximately 14.3 million tons per cord. Pine at 40% moisture produces approximately 10 million. The difference is substantial." Doc Harlan had not expected a frontier widow to discuss British thermal units with confidence, and the surprise showed on his face. He walked closer to examine the stacked wood under the extended roof. The pieces were split uniformly and stacked with gaps for airflow, raised off the ground on a lattice of small poles. The roof overhead kept them completely dry, while the open sides allowed wind to circulate. He picked up a split piece from the stack and a similar piece from a pile outside the structure. The covered piece was noticeably lighter, indicating lower moisture content despite being cut at the same time. The design was working exactly as she'd claimed. "Well," he said slowly, "I'll be interested to see how this performs come winter. But Mrs. Thornton, even if your efficiency calculations are correct, you're still gambling your children's lives on an untested theory. I hope you're right, so do I." Eliza said quietly. "So do I." September brought the kind of weather that made settlers nervous. Warm days that encouraged complacency, followed by cold nights that hinted at what was coming. Eliza cut and split wood with desperate focus, working until her hands bled and her back spasmed. The children helped where they could, but Tommy was only 9 and Sarah was slight for her age. Most of the heavy work fell to Eliza, and she felt it in every muscle. She was consuming more calories than she could replace, and her dresses hung loose on a frame that had never been heavy to begin with. By the end of September, she had 3 cords stacked under the extended roof, all of it drying faster than she dared hope. The elevated stacking and constant airflow were pulling moisture out at a remarkable rate, and pieces she'd cut 3 weeks earlier were already burning clean with minimal smoke. The efficiency gain was real and measurable, which meant her calculations were holding up under practical testing, but 3 cords still left her short of the 5.6 she needed. And October was bringing frost. The first snow came on October 18th, 3 inches of heavy wet flakes that melted by noon, but served as a warning. Eliza added a 4th cord to her stacks and began calculating more carefully. She'd been assuming a 7-month heating season from October through April, but if winter came early or stayed late, she'd need more. She started rationing heat, letting the cabin temperature drop to 55 at night and bundling the children in every blanket they owned. Tommy complained about the cold, but Sarah understood what was happening and kept her brother quiet. Silas Garrett stopped by in early November with a load of firewood in his wagon, "I've got extra," he said, which was a lie. Nobody had extra. Firewood in Montana territory. Thought you might could use it. Eliza's pride wanted to refuse, but her children's welfare overrode pride. "I'll pay you back in spring," she said. "I can take in laundry or mending." "No need," Silas said, unloading the wood into her covered corridor. "You helped Sarah teach my boy his letters last month. We'll call it even." It was charity disguised as trade, and they both knew it. But Eliza accepted because refusing would be foolish. The additional wood brought her to 4½ cords, which was still short but closer to survivable. Silas studied her structure while he worked, noting how the wood stayed completely dry under the extended roof, and how easy it was to access from the cabin door. "This design makes sense," he said finally. "I don't know why nobody thought of it before." "Because it looks strange," Eliza said. "People don't trust strange." Even when strange works better, November brought cold that settled in and stayed, dropping temperatures into the teens at night and barely reaching freezing during the day. Eliza burned wood steadily, feeding the stove every 4 hours to maintain livable temperatures. The convenience of having dry firewood within arm's reach became apparent. Immediately, she could reload the stove without putting on a coat or boots, without exposing the children to outside air, and without tracking snow into the cabin. The time savings alone was significant, but the real advantage was consistency. She never missed a feeding because the weather was too severe to go outside, which meant the cabin temperature stayed relatively stable instead of swinging wildly between overheated and freezing. By mid-December, she'd burned through 1½ cords, which put her slightly ahead of Higgins's estimate of 1 cord every 3 weeks. The efficiency gain from dry wood was proving even more significant than she'd calculated. She was getting approximately 35% more heat per piece than she would have from traditionally stored wood. The mathematics were working in her favor, but mathematics didn't account for catastrophe, and catastrophe was Montana's specialty. The blizzard arrived on January 3, 1874, pushed by Arctic wind that dropped temperatures 2 levels. That killed exposed flesh in minutes. The storm hit at dusk, with no warning beyond a sudden pressure drop that made ears pop and animals nervous. Within an hour, visibility was 0, and the temperature had fallen to 8 below 0 by midnight. It was 20 to below, and Eliza's cabin was surrounded by wind-driven snow that buried everything more than 3 feet high. Tommy had been fighting a fever for 2 days, the kind of deep chest cold that killed children in isolated homesteads where doctors were days away, even in good weather. His temperature was climbing despite Eliza's efforts to cool him with damp cloths, and he'd started coughing with a wet rattle that terrified her. He needed constant warmth and monitoring, which meant she couldn't leave him even for a moment. In a traditional setup with a separate woodshed, she'd have faced an impossible choice: leave a sick child alone to fetch firewood through killing cold, or let the fire die and watch the cabin temperature drop to lethal levels. Instead, she opened the door to her covered corridor and pulled wood from stacks that stood 3 feet away, bone dry and easily accessible. She could reload the stove every hour if necessary without ever losing sight of Tommy or exposing him to outside air. The extended roof kept the corridor completely clear of snow, while wind howled through the open sides, and the firewood remained as accessible if it were stored inside the cabin itself. She fed the stove steadily through the night, keeping the cabin temperature at 72, while the blizzard raged outside. This is the kind of frontier wisdom that saved lives through brutal winters. Practical innovations born from necessity. If you value these stories of settler ingenuity and want to help preserve this knowledge, subscribe to this channel. We're documenting the techniques and solutions that helped families survive impossible conditions, and your subscription helps keep these accounts alive for future generations who need to understand what real resilience looked like. By dawn, the temperature outside had dropped to 31 below 0, cold enough to freeze kerosene and make metal brittle. Inside Eliza's cabin, Tommy slept fitfully under 3 blankets. While the stove radiated steady heat, Eliza had burned through half a cord in 36 hours, double her normal rate, but the wood supply remained easily accessible, and the cabin stayed warm. She'd proven her design under the exact conditions that killed unprepared settlers. A medical emergency during extreme weather with no possibility of outside help. The storm lasted for days, dumping 43 inches of snow and maintaining temperatures below zero the entire time. When it finally cleared on January 7th, the landscape had transformed into a white desert with drifts reaching the eaves of traditional cabins. Settlers across the valley dug out from buried doorways and fought through waist-deep snow to reach wood piles that were either buried or blown into useless scattered piles. 3 families ran critically low on firewood because they couldn't reach their supplies, and one elderly man froze to death in his barn while trying to feed livestock. Eliza's firewood remained exactly where she'd stacked it, dry and accessible, protected by a roof that had shed snow as fast as it fell. The open-sided corridor had prevented drifting, while the elevated stacking kept every piece off the ground and ready to burn. She'd gone through the worst blizzard in recent memory without once struggling to reach fuel, and Tommy's fever had broken on the 3rd day. Because she'd been able to maintain consistent warmth while nursing him, Old Man Higgins came by on January 10th, breaking trail on snowshoes to check on families in the valley. He stood outside Eliza's structure for a long time, studying the design with the expression of someone recalculating assumptions. "How much wood did you burn during the storm?" he asked finally. "Half a cord over for days," Eliza said. "I kept the cabin at 70 to the whole time because Tommy was sick. Half a cord in for days is expensive," Higgins said. "Half a cord that I could reach without risking frostbite or leaving a sick child alone," Eliza countered. Jacob Morrison froze to death in his barn. How much would he pay for a design that kept his firewood accessible? Higgins had no answer for that. Morrison had been 63, experienced and careful, but he died anyway because his woodshed was 40 feet from his cabin and the storm had disoriented him. Eliza's design eliminated that risk entirely, and Higgins was honest enough to acknowledge it. "I was wrong about this," he said slowly. "I figured you were wasting time on foolishness, but this works better than traditional methods. I don't like admitting when I'm wrong, but I'm wrong here. This is smart building." Word spread through the valley with the speed of all frontier news. Someone had developed a better system, and people who valued survival over tradition wanted details. Silas Garrett came by to measure the post spacing and rafter angles. Reverend March stopped to examine the structure and admitted that perhaps the Lord inspired wisdom in unexpected forms. Even Widow Jenkins rode out from Unionville to see what had kept people talking through the winter, and she studied the design with the calculating eye of someone evaluating commercial potential. "How much would you charge to help someone build one of these?" Martha asked. "I'm not selling anything," Eliza said. "Anyone who wants to build one is welcome to copy the design. I'll answer questions if they ask. You could make money from this." Martha pressed, "Patent the design, charge licensing fees. There's profit in innovation." But Eliza had no interest in profit beyond survival. She'd built the structure because her family needed it, and if other families benefited from the same design, that was enough. The frontier was hard enough without people hoarding solutions to common problems, she explained. The key principles: extended roof for weather protection, elevated stacking for airflow and moisture prevention, proximity to the dwelling for accessibility during storms, and let people adapt them to their own situations. By the following summer, 7 families in the valley had built variations of Eliza's design. Some extended the roof on only 2 sides to save materials. Others built freestanding versions with the same principles, but separate from their cabins to address fire concerns. A few incorporated the covered corridor into barn designs, creating weather-protected paths between buildings. Each adaptation proved the core concept: keeping firewood dry, elevated, and accessible produced measurable advantages in efficiency and safety. Doc Harlan documented the result in a letter to the Territorial News paper, noting that families using covered wood storage systems had experienced 32% fewer cold-related illnesses during the winter of 1870 for to 75 compared to families using traditional methods. The difference was attributed to more consistent cabin temperatures and reduced exposure during fuel gathering. The letter sparked interest across Montana Territory, and by 1876 similar designs were appearing in homesteads from Bozeman to Missoula. The innovation spread because it solved a real problem. Using materials and skills that ordinary settlers possessed, it didn't require expensive equipment or specialized knowledge, just an understanding of basic principles and a willingness to challenge conventional wisdom. That combination was powerful on the frontier, where survival often depended on adapting old methods to new circumstances. Eliza's design echoed solutions developed by other cultures facing similar challenges. The Norse had built turf-roofed structures with integrated storage for centuries, understanding that proximity and weather protection were survival necessities in harsh climates. Native American tribes across the northern plains had developed lodge designs that incorporated fuel storage within the living structure, recognizing that exposure during storms was a primary killer. The Transcontinental Railroad workers in Wyoming had built snow sheds over tracks, using the same principle Eliza had applied: extend the roof to protect what matters most. Good ideas emerged independently across cultures because the underlying problems were universal, and effective solutions followed similar logic. The winter of 187,475 was milder than the previous year, but Eliza's second winter in the cabin was easier for reasons beyond weather. She'd entered the season with 7 full cords of properly seasoned wood, all of it stacked under cover and ready to burn efficiently. She'd learned to manage the stove more effectively, understanding exactly how much fuel produced optimal heat without waste. Most importantly, she'd proven to herself and her neighbors that a woman alone could not only survive, but thrive using intelligence and planning to overcome physical limitations. Tommy recovered fully from his fever, and by spring, he was helping cut and split wood with increasing skill. Sarah had grown tall and capable, managing household tasks that freed Eliza for outside work. Even Benjamin, now 5, could stack kindling and carry water without supervision. The family was becoming a functional unit, each member contributing according to ability, and the cabin that had seemed impossibly isolated in 1873 now felt like home. Silas Garrett proposed marriage in the spring of 1875, and Eliza accepted after careful consideration. It wasn't a romance born of passion, but a practical partnership between two people who respected each other's capabilities and shared the common goal of raising children successfully. In difficult country, they combined their homesteads, creating a larger operation that could support both families more efficiently. Silas built his own version of Eliza's wood storage system, extending the roof on his cabin and acknowledging that his new wife's design was superior to traditional methods. Old man Higgins died in the winter of 1877, frozen in his sleep at age 66 after his cabin fire went out during a cold snap. He'd lived through 29 Montana winters, but was ultimately killed by the same risk that threatened everyone: the gap between fuel supply and survival need. His death reminded the valley that experience alone wasn't enough. You also needed systems that functioned when you were sick, exhausted, or incapacitated. Eliza's design provided that redundancy, and families who'd adopted it understood they were marginally safer because of it. The innovation never made Eliza famous beyond the valley, and she never sought recognition. The design was simply absorbed into the local building tradition, becoming one of many small adaptations that helped settlers survive in marginal conditions. By 1880, it was difficult to find a homestead in the area that didn't incorporate some version of covered wood storage, and newcomers assumed it had always been done that way. The origin story faded as the innovation became standard practice, which is how most practical improvements disappear into the background of daily life. Modern eco-home designers have rediscovered similar principles, building passive solar structures with integrated thermal mass and weather-protected resource storage. The specific materials have changed: concrete, and steel instead of logs and shakes, but the underlying logic remains identical: keep essential resources dry, accessible, and close to where they're needed. Minimize exposure during adverse conditions. Use structure itself to solve problems rather than relying on human effort alone. These principles worked in 1870 for Montana Territory, and they work in contemporary sustainable architecture because they're based on physics rather than fashion. Eliza Thornton lived until 1923, dying at age 81 in the same valley where she'd arrived as a desperate widow 50 years earlier. Her obituary in the Helena Independent mentioned her work with the local school board and her contributions to the Methodist Church, but it didn't mention the wood storage design that had saved her family and influenced building practices across the region. The innovation had become invisible through success, integrated so thoroughly into local tradition that its origin was forgotten. But the principle survived in the cabins and barns that still dotted the valley in the 1920s, most of them featuring extended roofs and covered storage areas that kept firewood dry and accessible. The design had proven itself through decades of hard winters, and families who used it were marginally warmer, slightly safer, and measurably more efficient than they would have been otherwise. That margin was the difference between comfort and misery, sometimes between survival and death. And it existed because one woman had looked at a common problem and imagined a better solution. The frontier rewarded that kind of thinking not with fame or fortune, but with survival and the quiet satisfaction of knowing you'd solved something real. Eliza's neighbors had laughed at the shed that surrounded her cabin, right up until the blizzard proved them wrong. After that, they stopped laughing and started measuring post spacing. Because wisdom on the frontier wasn't about pride or tradition. It was about what worked when the temperature dropped to 30 below, and your children were depending on you to keep them alive. That's the kind of practical innovation that built communities in impossible places, not grand inventions or revolutionary technology, but small improvements that made hard lives slightly more manageable. If these stories resonate with you, if you value the preservation of frontier wisdom and the documentation of solutions that saved lives, subscribe to this channel. Help us keep these accounts alive for people who need to understand that real resilience comes from thinking clearly under pressure and having the courage to challenge conventional wisdom when survival demands it. Hit that subscribe button and let's preserve this knowledge together. The shed that surrounded Eliza Thornton's cabin looked strange to people who valued appearance over function, but it kept her firewood dry through the worst winter Montana Territory had seen in a decade. Sometimes the best solutions are the ones that make neighbors laugh right up until the moment they start taking notes. That's not pride talking, that's just mathematics, physics, and a woman who understood that survival doesn't care about tradition. It cares about what works when the storm hits and the temperature drops. And there's no one coming to help. Eliza figured that out in 1873, and 50 years later, her design was still keeping families warm because good ideas don't need recognition to be valuable, they just need to work.